Welcome to Pittsburgh Landing. In the spring of 1862, this quiet spot along the Tennessee River was identified as the gathering point for the two Union armies in central and western Tennessee. After the fall of Forts Henry and Donelson in February, control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers was in the hands of the Union. Nashville became the first Confederate state capital to fall, and newly promoted Major General Ulysses S. Grant brought his army here in mid-March. He was given orders to await Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio from Nashville, and only when Buell had arrived could he move out from his encampment here. This spot was selected because it had access to the river, space enough for up to 100,000 men to set up camp, and because it was protected on three sides by rivers and streams and swamps. The objective was the strategic railroad junction at Corinth in northern Mississippi. Taking Corinth would not only hinder the Confederacy's ability to move supplies throughout the region, it would be the jumping off point for the Union to move on to take Memphis or Vicksburg. Now, Confederate leadership also understood this, and they began to concentrate forces from across the region at Corinth to defend the town. General Johnston, in command at Corinth, knew that if Grant and Buell were able to join forces, they would heavily outnumber the Confederates and that he would be at a distinct disadvantage. Johnston decided to march north and strike first. The plan, which was drawn up by General P.G.T. Beauregard, called for the Confederate Army to rapidly cover the 20 miles north and strike Grant's army on April 4th, several days before Buell could arrive with reinforcements. They would attack Grant on his left and push him back toward the swampy ground around Owl Creek and away from the Tennessee River. Now, for his part, Grant seemed to believe that the Confederate Army wouldn't attempt such an attack, so despite some warnings that he should do so, he failed to issue any orders to prepare any sort of defensive position against possible attack from the south. It was a viewpoint that was shared by men such as General Sherman, who expressed the opinion that digging in would make the men timid and more vulnerable to attack, rather than offer protection. Now, there were a few problems with the Confederate attack plan. For one thing, Johnston was dealing with a brand new army that had just been assembled from scattered units across the region in the last few weeks. They were, for the most part, poorly trained, and the planned march dealt with problems from the outset. Beauregard's marching plan called for the units to cover the 20 miles in a single day, marching on multiple roads that weaved in and out of intersections where the units would occasionally cross paths. It was optimistic for the most seasoned of troops to cover that distance in a single day, and these were anything but that. The other major setback was the weather. No sooner had the march begun than it began to rain. The roads turned to mud, and it slowed everything down. It would be the afternoon of April 5th before the Confederate Army even arrived in position, and so the attack was set to take place in the early morning hours of April 6th, 2 days later than originally planned. On the evening of Saturday, April 5th, 1862, Grant's force here consisted of around 49,000 men in 6 divisions, spread out over about a half dozen miles. Though the signs here refer to the Army as the Army of the Tennessee, the use of that name to refer to Grant's force only began after the battle. The 1st Division of Grant's army was commanded by John McClernand, a war Democrat who had served in the United States Congress before the war. His division had borne the brunt of the fighting back at Fort Donelson, and for his service in that battle, McClernand had recently been promoted to Major General. Made up mostly of men from Illinois and Iowa, they were among the few real combat veterans that Grant had in his army. They were camped along the road northeast of Shiloh Church. Grant's 2nd Division was commanded by Brigadier General William H.L. Wallace, a man that Grant referred to in his memoirs as one of the best generals in the Union Army. These men were veterans, but Wallace was brand new to command of the division. He had just been promoted to Brigadier General and was replacing Charles Smith, who had been injured in an accident involving a rowboat. Wallace's division, which was comprised mostly of men from Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri, camped on the high ground near Pittsburgh Landing. The 3rd Division was commanded by Major General Lew Wallace. It was a mix of veteran and new units, mostly from Ohio and Indiana, having been formed right around the time of the Battle of Fort Donelson. The 34-year-old Lew Wallace was promoted for his service there, and at the time of the battle, he was the youngest major general in the Union Army. His division was 5 miles north of the main body at Crump's Landing, guarding the rear of the army and the road there. The 4th Division was commanded by Brigadier General Stephen Hurlbut. Hurlbut was a Southerner born and raised in South Carolina, but he came north to Illinois in the 1840s and got involved in politics. When the war broke out, he was a member of the Illinois House of Representatives. His division had men from all over what was then the western United States, and it contained a mix of veterans and also new recruits. His 4th Division was camped between McClernand's division in the west and the Tennessee River to the east. The 5th Division was commanded by Brigadier General William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman's men were primarily from his home state of Ohio. They had very little experience, but Sherman was the only one of Grant's 6 division commanders who had a West Point education. His division camped out here on the key ground in the southwest around the Shiloh Church. The 6th Division was commanded by Brigadier General Benjamin Prentiss. These men were from a variety of western states and had just been formed into a division in the weeks leading up to the battle. Like most of Grant's other commanders, he was a political appointee, a Virginian by birth, but committed to the Union cause. In his memoirs, Grant said of Prentiss, quote, "He was a brave and very earnest soldier. No man in the service was more sincere in his devotion to the cause for which we were battling, none more ready to make sacrifices or risk life in it," end quote. His men were camped to the southeast of Sherman's men on the southern perimeter of the army. Most of Grant's men were armed with Model 1841 rifle muskets and Model 1842 smoothbores. There were a few regiments with Springfield 1855s and a very select few, sometimes only company size, with Enfields or Lawrence rifles. 18,000 men in 4 divisions of Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio were converging on this position and would arrive throughout the day and into the night of April 6th. The Confederate force concentrated at Corinth was known as the Army of Mississippi, commanded by 59-year-old Albert Sidney Johnston. Now, we'll be talking more about him later in this series, but he was considered by both sides to have been one of the finest officers in the pre-war United States Army, and he was the 2nd highest ranking officer in the entire Confederacy. Johnston's army was a new one, formed from Confederate forces throughout the region. He put his 44,000 men into 4 small corps. Typically, an army of this size wouldn't have been divided into 4 separate corps, but this was done in part to deceive the enemy into thinking the force was larger than it really was. His 1st Corps contained 2 divisions with 2 brigades each, under the command of Major General Leonidas Polk, who was an Episcopal bishop and the second cousin of U.S. President James Knox Polk. He had graduated 8th in the West Point class of 1827, but resigned his commission soon after in order to attend seminary. When the Civil War broke out, he offered his services to a former classmate at West Point, Jefferson Davis. In late 1861, Polk was responsible for one of the earliest major blunders by the Confederacy during the war. He violated Kentucky's declared neutrality by moving his troops into the state, which prompted a Union response, which led to the North controlling most of the state for the remainder of the war. Most of Polk's men were from Tennessee. Now, the Second Corps was made up of 2 divisions with 3 brigades in each, and it was commanded by Major General Braxton Bragg, who also served as Johnston's chief of staff. Bragg had entered West Point at 16 years old and graduated 5th in a class of 50 that included future generals Joseph Hooker, John Sedgwick, and Jubal Early. Bragg was a strict disciplinarian who had been so disliked by the men under his command during the Mexican War that they had attempted to kill him on 2 separate occasions in 1847. One time they exploded a 12-pound artillery shell under his cot with him in it. The cot was destroyed, but Bragg survived. His men came primarily from Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi, and they were probably the best trained troops in the Confederate Army here at Shiloh. The Third Corps was really just a single division containing 3 brigades commanded by Major General William Hardee. Hardee was a year behind Braxton Bragg at West Point, graduating in the middle of his class of 1838. He'd been sent to France in 1840 to study military tactics and was a captain at the time of the Mexican War. He was captured in that war and exchanged, eventually being breveted a lieutenant colonel for his service in the 2nd Dragoons. During the 1850s, he taught tactics at West Point and authored the best-known book on military tactics that was used throughout the Civil War. His men came primarily from Arkansas and Tennessee. There was also a reserve corps of 3 brigades, commanded by Brigadier General John C. Breckinridge. Breckinridge was a politician who had just completed a 4-year term as the youngest vice president in the history of the United States. He was just 36 years old when he had taken that office. He came in second to Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 presidential election, then served the better part of a year as a senator from the state of Kentucky before resigning at the end of 1861 after accepting a commission in the Confederate Army. His men came from all over the South and included the brigade that would come to be known as the Orphan Brigade of Kentucky. Now, in addition to these officers, Johnston had a second 4-star general in his command, P.G.T. Beauregard. In addition to serving as Johnston's second in command, Beauregard was the author of the plans for the march north from Corinth and the attack on Grant's unsuspecting troops at Shiloh. Now, Johnston's army had very little combat experience and they were poorly equipped. Many of the men carried flintlocks, shotguns, squirrel rifles. Now, they had received a supply of Enfield rifles before the battle, and these were distributed to some units in time for the attack. But many of the men had very little experience using these weapons. As for Johnston's cavalry, 2/3 of them had no weapons at all. But what the Confederates had going for them that Grant did not was the initiative and hopefully the element of surprise.